The week Harlem went silent. Harlem, 1935. The rain that night did not fall gently. It pressed down on the streets as if the sky itself was angry, washing the sidewalks clean while leaving the truth buried beneath puddles and shadows. Streetlights flickered, jazz spilled faintly from basement clubs, and men hurried home with collars pulled high, not from the cold but from fear. Fear had a way of spreading in Harlem, quietly like smoke. Everyone knew Bumpy Johnson. They knew his walk slow, deliberate. They knew his eyes sharp, watching everything. And they knew one rule above all else. Harlem was under his protection. But that protection had limits. And that night someone crossed a line so dangerous that even the police chose to look away. The boy who wasn't supposed to die. His name was Eli Johnson. He was 17 years old, tall for his age, with a shy smile and hands still rough from working odd jobs along Lenox Avenue. Eli wasn't a gangster. He wasn't a fighter. He wasn't even brave in the way men pretend bravery looks like. He was brave in quieter ways. He walked his mother home after church. He helped neighbors carry groceries. He read books under the street lamp because their apartment light was broken. Most people knew him simply as Bumpy's sister's boy. And that was supposed to protect him. On a Tuesday evening, Eli was sent across town with a simple task: deliver a small envelope to a shopkeeper who owed Bumpy a favor. No threats, no weapons, just a message. He never came back. By Wednesday morning, whispers began. By Thursday, the whispers turned into silence. And by Friday, Harlem understood something terrible had happened. A message without words. Eli's body was found near the river, far from the music and warmth of Harlem's heart. The details were never written in the papers. The police report was thin, almost embarrassed, as if even the ink refused to tell the story. Unknown assailants. No witnesses. Case pending. But Harlem knew. The signs were there, not carved, not shouted, but deliberately arranged. A warning, a statement. This was not a random crime. This was not street violence. This was terror delivered carefully. The message was clear. Your name doesn't protect you anymore. When the news reached Bumpy, Bumpy Johnson heard the news without changing his expression. He was sitting in the back room of a bar, untouched whiskey in front of him, listening, not to the man speaking but to the pauses between words. That's where truth lived. When the name Eli was spoken, Bumpy closed his eyes, not in grief but in control. Men expected shouting. They expected broken glass. They expected revenge. Instead, Bumpy stood up calmly and said only one thing. Clear the room. When the door closed, silence fell heavy. Bumpy walked to the window and looked out over Harlem, over the streets he had fought for, bled for, negotiated for, streets he had promised to protect. This wasn't just a murder. This was an insult. And insults, when unanswered, became invitations. The police who saw nothing. By Saturday, something unusual happened. The police presence in Harlem increased, but not in the way people expected. Patrol cars rolled through, lights off. Officers stood on corners, watching not the neighborhoods but the people watching them. When Bumpy's men approached precinct doors, they were turned away. No comment. Not our jurisdiction. Open investigation. Behind closed doors, files were shuffled, names were removed, leads quietly died. Because everyone in that building understood one unspoken truth. This case wasn't about a boy. It was about power. And someone very powerful wanted this forgotten. 7 days begin. Sunday arrived like a held breath. Church bells rang, but prayers felt heavier than usual. Mothers pulled sons closer. Fathers avoided eye contact with strangers. Harlem didn't riot, it didn't scream. It waited. And Bumpy Johnson did the same. He didn't strike back immediately. He didn't send men out with guns. He didn't demand blood. Instead, he started asking questions. Quiet ones. Who was seen where? Who stopped returning calls? Which officers suddenly took leave? Which businesses received strange visits? Because Bumpy knew something most men didn't. Revenge rushed is revenge wasted. And whoever did this wanted chaos. Bumpy intended to give them something far worse. The first crack. On the 7th day, a patrol officer named Frank Doyle missed his shift. He wasn't sick. He wasn't injured. He was afraid. By nightfall, word reached Bumpy, not from threats, not from force, but from guilt. Doyle hadn't participated, but he had been told to stand down. And standing down sometimes was the same as pulling the rope yourself. When Bumpy heard this, he didn't smile. He nodded, because now he knew something important. This wasn't just hate. This was organized silence. And silence, when exposed, made cowards talk. The silence that started talking. By the second week after Eli's death, Harlem no longer felt like a neighborhood. It felt like a courtroom where no judge had arrived yet, where every face carried testimony and every silence hinted at guilt. People still went to work, shops still opened, music still played in the evenings, but something essential had shifted beneath the surface. Conversations stopped when unfamiliar footsteps approached. Windows stayed open longer at night, not for air, but to listen. Harlem was no longer asking what happened, it was asking who allowed it to happen. Bumpy Johnson understood this shift better than anyone. He had learned long ago that fear does not always make people run. Sometimes fear makes them observe more carefully. Sometimes it sharpens memory. And sometimes, when handled with patience, it turns into something stronger than anger, resolve. Bumpy did not move through Harlem like a storm. He moved like a shadow that lingered just long enough to be felt. He visited barbershops without speaking, sat quietly in churches without praying out loud, walked past police patrols without acknowledging them. Every step was deliberate because he knew something the city officials had forgotten. Power does not announce itself when it is confident, it waits. The police, on the other hand, were growing restless. Their silence had been ordered quickly, but maintaining it was harder than expected. Reports that should have been routine were delayed. Officers who normally laughed together during late shifts now avoided eye contact. A few requested transfers, others called in sick. It wasn't because they suddenly developed consciences overnight. It was because silence, when shared by too many people, begins to feel heavy, and heavy things eventually slip. Bumpy noticed this long before anyone else did. He noticed which officers stopped patrolling certain blocks, which names disappeared from duty rosters, and which files were locked away with unusual urgency. Patterns once seen could not be unseen. One afternoon, Bumpy received word about a man named Samuel Reed, a dock worker with no criminal record and no reputation for trouble. Reed had been present near the river the night Eli was killed, not because he wanted to be, but because his shift ran late and the riverfront was the fastest way home. Reed had not spoken to the police, not because he had nothing to say, but because when he tried, he was told, politely, firmly, and unmistakably, to forget what he had seen. That kind of instruction stayed with a man. It followed him into his dreams. It made every knock on the door sound like a warning. By the time Reed's name reached Bumpy, the man was already considering leaving Harlem altogether. Bumpy chose not to summon him. Instead, he sent someone Reed trusted, not with promises, not with threats, but with reassurance. The message was simple and carefully phrased. No one would ask him to be brave, only honest. That distinction mattered. Reed met Bumpy in a quiet place, away from the river and away from witnesses, and what he said did not come out all at once. It arrived slowly, interrupted by long pauses and trembling hands. Reed spoke of men who did not belong in Harlem, of vehicles parked where they should not have been, of uniforms that turned away before questions could be asked. He spoke of a moment when he realized the police were not searching for answers, only for endings. When Reed finished, Bumpy did not congratulate him or praise his courage. He simply listened, because listening, when done correctly, tells a person their words matter. That meeting changed nothing on the surface and everything underneath. Bumpy now knew the outline of the machinery that had moved against his family, and more importantly, he knew it was not invincible. Systems built on fear rely on everyone being afraid forever. They fail when even one person decides fear is no longer affordable. Reed was not a hero, and Bumpy did not want him to be. He arranged for Reed to leave the city quietly, not as an act of escape, but of survival. Truth, Bumpy believed, did not require martyrs. It required witnesses who lived long enough to speak again. As the days passed, pressure began to mount in places that were not visible to the public. City officials held closed meetings that produced no minutes. Police leadership issued reminders about professional discretion that sounded more like warnings than guidance. Newspapers received anonymous tips they were advised not to publish. The effort to contain the truth was becoming more complicated, and complications breed mistakes. One such mistake came in the form of an internal memo that circulated too widely before being recalled. It referenced Eli's case not as an investigation, but as a completed matter, despite the absence of suspects or conclusions. Bumpy obtained a copy without stealing it, without coercion, and without ever touching the paper himself. It arrived through the same channels silence had traveled through, human weakness. Harlem, meanwhile, was changing its posture. Where there had been fear, there was now watchfulness. Mothers still warned their children, but they also told them to remember faces. Shopkeepers still closed early, but they kept notes. Ministers spoke of patience in their sermons, but patience paired with vigilance. No one was calling for violence. No one was marching. The city's restraint was more unsettling to its enemies than chaos would have been. Quiet communities, Bumpy knew, frightened powerful men far more than loud ones. The police commissioner began to feel the weight of this restraint. It manifested not in protests but in scrutiny. Questions from city council members grew more pointed. Community leaders requested meetings that could no longer be postponed. Even officers who had followed orders without objection began to worry about what those orders might cost them in the long run. Silence had protected them briefly, but now it was isolating them. And isolation, in institutions built on loyalty, is dangerous. Bumpy never appeared at these meetings. He did not need to. His influence was not measured by presence but by anticipation. Officials spoke his name only when doors were closed, and even then reluctantly. They knew he was not looking for vengeance in the traditional sense. He was looking for acknowledgement. A system could survive brutality, it could not survive exposure. Toward the end of the second week, an unexpected thing happened. A mid-level officer, not powerful enough to shape policy and not insignificant enough to be ignored, requested a private audience with a journalist known for discretion. The meeting produced no immediate article, no explosive headline, but it planted something far more dangerous. Doubt about official narratives, doubt about convenient conclusions, doubt about who was truly being protected. Bumpy heard about this not because he orchestrated it, but because movements, once set in motion, develop momentum of their own. By the time Sunday arrived again, Harlem felt different than it had 7 days earlier. It was still wounded, still grieving, but it was no longer passive. The city understood that what had happened to Eli was not an isolated cruelty but a test of whether fear could rewrite the rules, of whether names and influence could be erased by intimidation. Bumpy stood at his window that night, looking out at streets that had raised him and shaped him, and for the first time since his nephew's death, his expression softened, not into relief but into certainty. The people who believed they could act without consequence had misunderstood one crucial thing about Harlem. It did not forget, it did not rush, and when it decided to remember out loud, it did so in ways that could not be dismissed as noise. The silence that once protected the guilty was beginning to crack, not because of force, but because too many people had grown tired of carrying it alone. This was not yet justice, it was preparation. It was the slow, deliberate turning of a wheel that had been stuck for too long. And as that wheel began to move, those who had ordered the city to look away realized something they had not anticipated. The most dangerous moment is not when people are angry, but when they become patient with purpose. Well, when patience became pressure. By the time the third week began, Harlem no longer felt like a place under watch, it felt like a place under judgment. The difference was subtle but profound. Fear had not vanished, but it had transformed, reshaped itself into something steadier and more deliberate. People were no longer whispering out of terror but out of strategy. They understood now that whatever force had taken Eli's life depended on invisibility, on the belief that Harlem would respond the way it always had, loudly, emotionally, and without coordination. But this time the response was measured, it was thoughtful, and it was quietly relentless. Bumpy Johnson moved through this atmosphere with a calm that unsettled even those closest to him. Men who had once followed him because of his reputation now followed him because of his restraint. He did not issue threats or promises. He did not demand loyalty through fear. Instead, he reminded people of something deeper and more difficult: responsibility. Responsibility to remember, to observe, and to refuse to accept convenient lies. In meetings that never appeared on any record, Bumpy spoke less than others expected, allowing silence to do the work for him. Silence, he knew, forced people to confront their own thoughts, and thoughts once stirred were harder to control than actions. Inside the police department, the strain was becoming impossible to hide. Officers who had been instructed to look away were discovering that looking away required constant effort. Every unanswered question, every missing report, every unexplained decision added another weight to a structure already burdened by contradiction. The department had been built to project authority and order, but now it was struggling with something far more destabilizing: uncertainty. Some officers began to ask themselves not whether the silence was legal, but whether it would eventually become visible, and what that visibility would cost them personally. Careers built over decades could unravel in a moment if the wrong truth surfaced at the wrong time. The city's leadership sensed this instability and attempted to regain control through procedure. Committees were formed, reviews were announced, carefully worded statements promised transparency while offering none, but these gestures only deepened suspicion because Harlem had learned to recognize performance. What the community wanted was not reassurance, it was acknowledgement. They wanted someone to say that Eli's life mattered enough to warrant honesty. And the absence of that acknowledgement spoke louder than any press release. Bumpy watched these developments without intervening directly. He understood that pressure, when applied correctly, did not need guidance. It needed time. He also understood something that many powerful men forget. Institutions rarely collapse from external attack, they fracture from internal doubt. Every officer who questioned an order, every official who hesitated before signing a document, every journalist who wondered why certain facts were being avoided contributed to a widening crack that could no longer be ignored. Bumpy's role was not to force that crack open, but to prevent it from being sealed again. Meanwhile, Harlem's residents were redefining what resistance looked like. There were no marches, no riots, no dramatic confrontations. Instead, there was presence. People attended community meetings in greater numbers. Church gatherings turned into forums for shared memory. Stories that had once been dismissed as rumors were retold with careful attention to detail, cross-checked and preserved. It was a collective act of remembrance, and it carried a quiet power. Those who had relied on fear to erase truth began to realize that memory, when shared, could be more durable than intimidation. One evening, Bumpy received word that a senior officer had privately requested reassignment to another city. The request cited personal reasons, but the timing was unmistakable. This officer had not been at the river, had not given direct orders, but had been present when those orders were discussed. His departure was not an admission, but it was a retreat, and retreats are rarely unnoticed. Others within the department began to wonder whether staying silent was worth the risk of being left behind when accountability finally arrived. The newspapers too were shifting. Articles that once avoided specifics began to include questions. Editorials spoke cautiously about community trust and the importance of thorough investigations. Nothing was stated outright, but the tone had changed. It was no longer defensive, it was exploratory. Bumpy read these pieces carefully, not for what they said, but for what they now allowed readers to consider. Possibility, he believed, was the first step toward truth. As days passed, Bumpy found himself reflecting on Eli not with the rawness of loss, but with clarity. His nephew had not been a symbol by choice, yet he had become one by circumstance. Bumpy did not romanticize this. He understood the cruelty of it. But he also understood that moments of injustice, when met with patience rather than chaos, could force systems to reveal themselves. Eli's death had tested Harlem's resolve, and Harlem had answered not with violence but with vigilance. That response confused those who had expected fear to scatter the community, and confusion, in the hands of the powerful, often led to mistakes. One such mistake came when a closed-door meeting was leaked, not in content but in existence. The mere fact that certain officials had met privately to discuss containment strategies was enough to raise alarms. Containment of what? People asked if there was nothing to hide. The question spread quietly, but it spread relentlessly. Bumpy did not need to amplify it. He allowed it to move on its own, carried by the very networks of influence that had once worked against him. By the end of the third week, it was clear that the effort to suppress the truth had failed, not because it had been challenged head-on, but because it had been surrounded by attention. Attention, unlike anger, does not exhaust itself quickly. It watches, it waits, and it remembers. The city could no longer pretend that Eli's case was closed because too many people had begun to understand that closure without truth was not closure at all. Bumpy stood once again at his window, looking out over Harlem, and for the first time he allowed himself a quiet acknowledgement of progress. Not victory, not justice, but movement. The wheel he had set in motion through restraint and resolve was turning, slowly but undeniably. Those who had believed they could control the narrative were discovering that narratives, once questioned, rarely returned to their original shape. This was the stage no one could skip. Before accountability comes exposure, and before exposure comes discomfort. The city was uncomfortable now, and discomfort was a sign that the truth was close enough to be felt. Bumpy knew that the next phase would not be gentle, it never was, but he also knew that whatever came next would not be born of chaos, but of clarity. And clarity, once achieved, had a way of demanding answers from even the most protected corners of power. When looking away became impossible. By the time the fourth week arrived, the city understood something it had tried desperately to avoid. The moment for pretending had passed. What began as an attempt to bury a crime beneath silence had slowly transformed into a mirror held up to power itself, and mirrors have a way of making people uncomfortable even when no accusations are spoken aloud. Harlem felt this shift before it was acknowledged anywhere else. The streets were still the same, the buildings unchanged, but the atmosphere carried a quiet certainty, as if the city itself had decided that whatever came next would not be stopped. People were no longer waiting for answers out of fear, they were waiting because they knew answers were coming. Bumpy Johnson sensed this certainty as clearly as anyone. He did not mistake it for victory because he had lived long enough to know that systems rarely collapse dramatically. They adjust, they concede selectively, and they attempt to preserve themselves by offering controlled accountability. What mattered now was not how loud the truth would be, but how far it would reach. Bumpy's focus remained fixed on that distinction. He understood that justice, if it arrived only as a performance, would leave the deeper problem untouched. The city did not need another explanation. It needed recognition of responsibility, even if that recognition came wrapped in reluctance. Inside city offices and precinct halls, conversations grew tense. Officials who had once spoken confidently about procedure and order now chose their words with care. The weight of scrutiny had begun to shift alliances. Some who had quietly supported the silence distanced themselves, while others attempted to position themselves as advocates for transparency, hoping to be seen on the right side of history when the story inevitably surfaced. This reshuffling did not go unnoticed. It revealed something important. The silence had never been unanimous. It had only appeared that way because fear had kept dissent hidden. Now that fear was losing its grip. The turning point did not come with a dramatic arrest or a public confession. It came as Bumpy expected through documentation. Records that should not have existed in duplicate appeared. Timelines that had once seemed vague were suddenly precise. A series of internal communications, stripped of names but heavy with implication, found their way into the hands of people who knew how to read between lines. These documents did not shout, they did not accuse. They simply contradicted the official version of events so thoroughly that denial became exhausting. The effort required to maintain the lie began to outweigh the cost of acknowledging the truth. When the police commissioner finally addressed the matter publicly, the language was careful and restrained. He spoke of failures, of procedural oversights, and of the need for renewed trust. He did not mention Eli by name, but everyone understood who the statement was about. Harlem listened without applause and without outrage. It had learned patience too well to waste energy on reaction. What mattered was not the speech itself, but what followed it. Within days, reassignment announcements were made. Reviews were expanded. External oversight was quietly welcomed rather than resisted. These were not acts of courage, they were acts of necessity. Bumpy observed these developments with a steady calm. He did not attend hearings or issue statements. He did not need to. His role had never been to stand in the spotlight, but to ensure that the light existed. In private moments, he reflected on Eli not as a victim whose death demanded revenge, but as a catalyst whose life had forced a reckoning. This was not a comforting thought, and Bumpy did not romanticize it. He understood the unfairness of it deeply. But he also understood that history often moves forward on the backs of those who never asked to be symbols. What mattered was what the living chose to do with that burden. Harlem's response to the unfolding accountability was measured and dignified. Community leaders spoke not of triumph, but of responsibility. Ministers reminded congregations that justice was not only about exposure, but about rebuilding trust where it had been broken. Parents spoke to children about vigilance without hatred, about memory without obsession. The city was teaching itself a lesson it had learned too late too many times before. Anger fades quickly, but clarity endures. This clarity did not erase pain, but it gave that pain direction. The officer who had first spoken indirectly to a journalist was eventually called to testify in a closed review. His account did not include dramatic revelations. Instead, it detailed small decisions, moments of hesitation, and instructions framed as suggestions rather than orders. It was in many ways the most damaging testimony possible, because it revealed how easily responsibility could be diluted when no one was willing to say no. The review's conclusions, released weeks later, avoided assigning singular blame. They spoke instead of culture, of patterns, and of the dangers of institutional silence. It was not the justice many had imagined, but it was the beginning of accountability that could not be undone. For Bumpy, the resolution came quietly. One evening he returned to the river where Eli's life had ended. There were no crowds, no ceremonies, and no words spoken aloud. He stood there not to mourn publicly, but to acknowledge privately that the cycle had been interrupted. The message sent through terror had failed. It had not produced obedience or retreat. It had produced attention, memory, and ultimately exposure. That outcome did not erase the loss, but it ensured it would not be meaningless. The city moved forward slowly and imperfectly, as cities always do. Some officials kept their positions, some officers resigned, policies were adjusted, promises were made. None of this was enough on its own, but together it marked a shift. Harlem had demonstrated that restraint could be more powerful than reaction, that patience could apply pressure more effectively than force, and that refusing to look away could change outcomes even when the odds felt immovable. In the end, Bumpy did not see himself as the architect of this change. He saw himself as a steward of a moment, someone who had chosen not to let grief dictate action but to let principle guide it instead. That choice, difficult and lonely as it was, had altered the course of events in ways no weapon ever could. The lesson was not about power or influence, it was about discipline. About understanding that justice pursued without clarity often collapses under its own weight, while justice pursued with patience has a chance to stand. Harlem remembered Eli not with monuments but with awareness. His name became a reminder, spoken quietly, that silence protects only those who abuse it, and that communities willing to wait, watch and speak together can force even the most guarded systems to respond. This was not the ending anyone would have chosen, but it was an ending shaped by resolve rather than rage, and in that distinction lay its strength. The city did not forget, it did not rush, and it did not look away again.